Sorry, I have a question. We have to expose in English or we can do it in Spanish? I don't listen to you. You have the microphone shut down. Okay.
I mean, I'm fine with either. So if if your presentation is in Spanish, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so should I start?
Yep. Please go ahead.
Okay. So hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. So I'm gonna present a joint work with Lucas Mariani from Economic Research Southern Africa. And the paper is the role of restructuring in bank M&As, evidence from branch level data. So yeah, so we start with stating the fact that bank M&As are a focus of attention of regulators and academics, and the usual concern about that regulators have is that there is anti-competitive effects that cannot outweigh the gains in potential efficiency gains or gains in stability, like the banks become larger and more stable, and this has been reflecting in recent academic work. So apart from a few exceptions, most of the works use M&As, like they focus on these anti-competitive effects of M&As, and somehow the role of restructuring is left to a second place. But we know that as the interest is that M&As are like they're accompanied by like very important changes, like such as restructuring of production factors like changes in corporate control and in management practice, and there's all this which are called like all these other changes we are calling like restructuring. So and these changes are quite important for generating efficiency gains and so on. So the goal is to depart a bit from the literature in bank and try to understand triggers changed by bank M&A, like beyond changes in market power. So you're interested in the this other side of the story, that banks M&As consolidation can generate like efficiency gains. So in general, there is evidence that M&As do generate efficiency gains, but in other industries. So there's two papers that we are citing here. They're like Braginski et al. and David. They study like other industries, but very little know about these efficiency gains in the banking industry. So that's apart from like a few exceptions, there is most of these studies, as I mentioned, focus on just the anti-competitive effects. So those studies that study efficiency gains that result from M&As, they explore different mechanisms, and one of the mechanisms is like labor reallocation and labor restructuring. So this the literature using like all the data from all the industries, they do find a very important role of labor restructuring. But we don't even though we know that loan officers are very important, like for the quantity and quality of credit provision, there is no evidence about such relocations in the banking industry. So that's we're going to try to document like labor relocation in banking as well. And different from other industries, like it's relatively easy to relocate funding, which is it's a very important production factor in banks. So it's relatively easy to relocate funding across the branch network in comparison to other industries. So that, as I mentioned, there's a vast literature on the adverse effects of M&As, of bank M&As, like mainly focused on on competition, credit provision, right? But it's as I mentioned, there's no, we don't know much about how banks restructure after these M&As, and it's as we want to document like efficiency gains, this is challenging using like, for example, revenues data, because sometimes you can observe an increase in profitability, but this increase is completely driven by like an increase in markups instead of an increase in physical productivity. So that's a challenge from, that's when you look at the effect of M&As in other places, they combine both, like, let's say, higher markups with restructuring. So it's very hard to disentangle these two effects. And most of the literature also do comparison across markets. So markets with overlapping branches in general, from both like the acquirer and the target, versus markets with no overlapping branches. So that's, but it's very likely the restructuring process and other factors also play a role differently across this market. So we think the effects that these papers uncover can be confounded by other changes. And we know that there is some heterogeneous response of target and acquired branches after an M&A, but we know very little about the mechanism behind this, these heterogeneous responses. So I mean, just to sum up, we're going to try to contribute to this literature by trying to understand how banks restructure and potential efficiency gains from banks from this restructuring and heterogeneous responses. So we're going to have very rich matched employee branch data that's going to include employee characteristics and the branch. So we're going to match the employees with branches, and we have employee characteristics such as wage, tenure, education, occupation. For example, we know whether the individual is a loan officer or a bank teller or a manager, and we have the bank branch identifier. So we have very rich data at the worker level, and at the same time we also have branch characteristics such as location, balance sheet information, such as deposits, loans, and income statement at the branch level. So we have total revenues and total costs at the branch level, and we can follow these branches both from the acquired and target before and after the events, because we can identify them. So we're going to do like a stack of difference in difference. So we're going to basically follow, our sample is going to be, we're going to look 3 years before and 6 years after each consolidation. And our control group is going to be comprised of branches from other 2 private banks that end up through consolidation outside our sample. So we finish our sample around 2015, and they also go for a consolidation, but after our sample, and after our sample period. And so because government banks play an important role in Brazil, we are using private banks as our control group. So just to illustrate what we're going to do, so here we have some examples. So here, for example, we have this example with overlapping markets, right? So we have a target branch with a market share of 10%, an acquired branch, for example, with a market share of 30%, and a control branch of one of those private banks, right? So after the M&A, right, in this municipality A, they have a small increase in market share from let's say 30 to 40% from this global market share. We still have the control branch, right? And we're going to have, so we have like a small increase in market share, and we're also going to have a restructuring, right, going on here, right? So, and potentially it's going to be easier to relocate, right? So for example, transferring employees from the target to the acquired branch, and etc. So it's particularly regarding labor restructuring, it's potentially easier to do this in this type of markets. And we're calling municipality here, but that's going to be our definition of market. This example, municipality B, for example, there is also the same composition, but then there's a large increase in market share, and you're going to look at comparisons, what's going on here with comparison with the control range, and in comparison to the control range. Here, for example, there is no overlapping markets. You only have the target branch, right? So after the M&A, there is no increase in local market power, but we still have some restructuring, right, going on. And here for the acquirer, so we have the same thing. There's no increase in market power, but there is still some restructuring going on. So we have these examples because one of the as one of our goals to try to disentangle this market, increasing markups from efficiency gains. It's important to somehow control to market power. So in our setting, you have a lot of heterogeneity in the market power gain after the M&A. So in some places there is like this one, municipality B, there is a huge increase in market power. So that's an effect that we uncover here. They're going to be a composition of market power and restructuring, right? But in other examples, so for example, in this example, the increase in market power is smaller. So most of the effects are going to be coming from restructuring. That's why we want to do this. So somehow we're going to want to control for this increase in market power because you're interested in documenting efficiency gains, and you want to to clean for the fact that higher markups, for example, increase the profitability, but not necessarily the productivity of the branches. So so our strategy is we're gonna look different from other papers in the literature. We're gonna look at within markets, right? So we're comparing branches, for example, within the same market, right? So this allows us to to control for, let's say, market time fixed effects. So we can control for time varying changes in the demand and creditworthiness shocks at the individual level. We're going to be able to document heterogeneous effects on the target and acquire branch. And you're going to be able to control for different effects of reduction in competition and its spillover effects to other branches. So basically what we're going to do is like a different strategy, and we're going to stack it, right? And the main, we're going to be able to control for these gains in market power, and for time varying changes in the demand and creditworthiness of the borrowers in that market. And this is important because many of our M&As are occurred around the financial crisis. So it's possible that municipalities with different exposure to the target and acquire branch, or more that have more banks they're going to follow different trajectories after the shock. So it's when you control for this time varying demand and creditworthiness, we're sort of accounting for this potential, the fact that absent M&A, municipalities can follow different trajectories after like an aggregate shock like the financial crisis. So here are some descriptive status. So our about at the branch level, right? So they have like around for example 19 employees, control branch, target branch 17 employees, market share 33-25. Education of the workers, half of the workers have tertiary education. Here's a measure of skill of loan officers and employees, and here are measures of profit, profit per work, measures of productivity, right? So profit per worker. So, for example, target branches are target branches and acquire branches have sort of the same. This is a measure of productivity, similar measure of productivity, lending per worker, and deposits per worker. So these are statistics at the branch level, and in general they are not very different in general. Even though it's not super relevant for our empirical strategy, it's good that they're not very different. Here the conglomerate level. So something that I want to stress here is that usually the acquirer is slightly larger than the target, but as I said, that's fine because we are looking we're doing a diff and diff. And one thing that's important is that we are looking at very large banks. So these banks have more than 1,000 branches, and this means that so on a concern about if you're looking at M&As of small banks, that some of the effects were they would be present even in absence of the M&A, right? Because of endogeneity of the M&A. But here we are looking at this very local market. So we think the small local market in the countryside of Brazil is independent of the M&A choice at the conglomerate level. So this is sort of to address the the fact that M&As do not happen like exogenously. So we're dealing with very large banks, and we're looking at local markets. So here is our first set of results. So we find that, again, in comparison to control branches within the same municipality, we find and controlling for gains in market share, we find that the target bank has a decrease in lending, and whereas the acquirer bank has an increase in lending. So there is some lending, the target bank cuts lending, the branch of the target bank cuts, while the branch of the acquirer bank increases lending, in comparison to a control branch of within the same municipality. Here are the graphs. So you see, for example, in the acquirer branch, we see a large and persistent gain in lending. Same for the deposits, yet it's the gain in deposits is smaller. While for the target, we see a decrease in lending and deposits, we see like a decrease, but it's not statistically significant. And here we can see that, for example, for the acquirer branch, the gain in lending is much larger than the growth in deposits. So we see that some of this gain in lending must come from funding that is coming from other branches. So as we mentioned, like in the introduction, banks can relocate very easily funding across the network. So in this case, if for example, it suggests evidence that if lending is growing much faster than deposits, some of this lending is being funded not by local deposits, but from deposits from other branches that here we're going to look at labor restructuring. So we see a decrease in the labor force of target branches, and an increase in the labor force of acquired branches. And most of this increases is going to come from net internal transfers. So for example, the target branch loses many employees because of net internal transfers, and also net hirings. And interestingly, here we have our measures of this. We want to see whether banks are relocating employees optimally across their network, and we have this interesting result that the acquired banks have acquired branches, they have a large increase in the skill of the loan officers. So this restructuring is resulting in an improvement, not only in the total number of employees of the acquired branch, but in the quality of these loan officers as well. And as we mentioned, this is important because we know that there is now like some compelling evidence that loan officers are really, really important in the credit provision business, right? So both quantity, quality of credit provision, like monitoring of borrowers, screening. So they do play like a very important role, and when banks go for an M&A, they seem to, for example, to be relocating high skill loan officers to acquire branches. And okay, so now we have our results on productivity. So we here are measures of productivity, right? Are lending by employees, deposits by employees, and profits by employees, right? And then, as I was mentioning, these measures could be driven from an increase in profits by employees, could be driven by increasing markets, right? But we are trying to control here for increasing market share to clean for this effect. And interestingly, we find that acquired branches become much more productive at generating granting credit, right? So the lending by employees, even though the number of employees, the denominator is increasing a lot here, lending by employees is increasing. So this suggests that they're becoming more productive, right? In terms of lending provision, right? For deposits, we don't see much, but interesting for profits, we see for profitability per employee, right? Profits per employee, we see an increase in both the target and acquired branch. So this, in terms of profits, both both target and acquire branches seem to have their productivity increased after the event. So this, again, a suggestive event that the restructuring is important at fostering this increase in productivity. So our next result is trying to understand, you know, how is this productivity increasing in target branches and any acquire branches. So and then we find like a very interesting result that you know, profits are increasing in both branches, right? While revenue is only increasing in acquire branches. But interesting, this, you know, this increase in profitability seems to be driven by like cost reduction in the target branches. So they're cutting costs, right? And even though costs are increasing in acquire branches, right, because they're becoming much more effective at, you know, generating revenues, in the end the net effect is positive in the acquire branch. So even though they're increasing costs and labor costs because they're getting more skilled workers, right, their profitability is increased. So the channels are very different. So the profitability is increasing target branches because of cost reduction, both labor and other costs, while the productivity is increasing in acquire branch because they're even though costs are increasing, because they're getting more productive at granting loans. So going to the conclusion, I think maybe I might be a bit early, but you know, our paper adds to the discussion on bank M&As by documenting like effects beyond reduction in competition. So that's, you know, you're really trying to document how banks restructure. We provide the evidence that, you know, branch reorganization plays a major role in these M&As, and conglomerates like relocate labor, talent to acquire branches, right? And these branches experience higher levels of credit supply and deposits. And the post-merger restructuring increase employee productivity and branch profitability of target and acquire branches. But as we documented, most of the increase in profitability comes from cost reduction in target branch, and you know, and an increase in the productivity of lending provision in acquired branches. So that's it.
Thank you, and perfectly on time. Any questions from the audience? All right, if not, I guess we can start with the second presentation. Vivian?
Okay, listo. Listo, entonces voy a compartir pantalla. I want to share my screen. Okay. Do you see my presentation?
Yes.
Are you okay that I do my presentation in Spanish? It's no problem for the public.
For me, no, and I'm guessing it's not for the rest.
Okay.
I'll also give you a 5-minute warning for the 25 minutes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Bueno, el título de nuestro trabajo es Prepayment Penalties and Commercial Loans Evidence from Colombia. Los autores de este paper son el doctor Carlos Medina, el doctor Cristian Pozo del Banco de la República, el doctor Diego Restrepo y yo, pues Vivian Cruz Castañeda, de la Universidad EAFIT en Medellín. Bueno, para contarles de qué se trata el trabajo, pues seguiré la siguiente agenda. Primeramente les presentaré una introducción donde les contaré la motivación del trabajo, cuáles son sus principales objetivos, cuál es la contribución a la literatura, un poquito de la revisión de literatura. Hablaremos también de la estrategia empírica que desarrollamos para poder detectar pues, los resultados, los datos, los resultados empíricos y las conclusiones del trabajo. Pues la principal motivación de nuestro trabajo viene dado de que pues nosotros sabemos que existe un riesgo de prepago de los créditos, ya que prepagar los créditos es una opción que puede tener un cliente antes de que madure pues el crédito, es decir, antes que llegue a su fecha final del contrato. Y que los bancos, pues en la literatura se reporta que generalmente los bancos, para reducir los riesgos de liquidez, de variaciones en las tasas de interés, ellos cargan a los prestatarios de préstamo de penalidades para evitar que ellos prepaguen estos créditos antes de la madurez de ellos, con el riesgo de eliminar pues estos tipos de riesgos con respecto a los bancos, pues con respecto a los bancos. Entender los riesgos de prepago ayuda a que los reguladores en los mercados crediticios puedan diseñar mejores políticas con respecto a mantener estabilidad financiera y, digamos, saber si realmente esas penalidades están afectando en términos de eficiencia y de bienestar tanto a los consumidores como en este caso serían los prestatarios o como a los bancos que serían los que hacen los préstamos. Previos estudios generalmente se han enfocado solamente en mercados de créditos hipotecarios, es decir, en la revisión de literatura pues, minuciosa que hicimos, la mayoría de los trabajos se enfocan especialmente a cómo se comportan las penalidades de prepago y comportamiento de los prepagos en los créditos solamente en mercados hipotecarios. ¿Y qué ocurre? ¿Por qué nosotros decidimos hacerlos en mercado, pues en un mercado de créditos comerciales en Colombia? Y es que el 50% del mercado crediticio de Colombia corresponde a créditos comerciales. Entonces, consideramos que es un mercado de alta importancia y de impacto y de importancia en términos de política para los bancos, dado a la gran importancia que tienen en el total de créditos. Además, Colombia es un país donde el mercado crediticio está muy concentrado en pocos bancos. Si observamos pues en este gráfico, vemos que Bancolombia, siendo el principal banco, tiene una concentración, digamos, de créditos del 32%, Banco de Bogotá un 17%, luego Da Vivienda un 13%, y ya el resto de los bancos pues se reparten porcentajes mucho más pequeños. Entonces observamos que el total de créditos por banco pues se encuentra muy concentrado y digamos que eso nos da iniciativa de que los bancos pueden tener mucho poder de mercado a la hora pues de establecer sus tasas de interés y digamos sus políticas. En la literatura encontramos que los resultados que hacen sobre temas de prepagos de crédito, especialmente en mercados hipotecarios, han encontrado dos puntos de vista, es decir, los autores han llegado a dos conclusiones que se contradicen totalmente. Algunos hablan de que tienen de que las penalidades de prepago se ponen en términos de una vista predatoria y por otro lado, algunos llegan a las conclusiones de que se hacen en vistas a términos de eficiencia. Entonces, digamos que los resultados reportados en la literatura son heterogéneos, es decir, aplicados a mercados hipotecarios, y contienen importantes diferencias en términos de cuáles son los efectos de eliminar las penalidades de prepago en el comportamiento tanto de los prestamistas como los prestatarios. Por ejemplo, podemos citar en la literatura a Quercia, Stedman, David 2007, Rose 2008, Pennington Cross 2010 y Demen-Young, Cohen y Van Hemmer en el 2011, que encuentran que las penalidades de prepago aumentan los costos de las personas que piden préstamos y que reducen sus habilidades intertemporales de tomar decisiones en los mercados crediticios. Entonces, digamos de que si ellos tienen la posibilidad de poder pues obtener, digamos, un dinero y poder realizar el prepago de un crédito, estas penalidades comprometen su comportamiento ya que ellos deciden no pagarlos para no estar afectados por ellas y digamos que muchas veces pueden entrar en que aumente la probabilidad de default de sus créditos por tenerlos a largo plazo y no tener la posibilidad de pagarlos. Por ejemplo, otros autores encuentran, como es de Mayan también en el 2011, y Mayer, Piskorski and Tishischi en 2011, encuentran de que las penalidades son muy efectivas en proteger a los bancos del riesgo de prepago, y que le permite, pues, y que le permite a ellos mantener tasas de interés más pequeñas y que los créditos pues sean mucho más accesibles a todas las personas que desean pedirlos. ¿Qué más? Entonces, digamos que pues eso es partiendo del tema de la literatura, pero entonces encontramos que en el año 2012, el 9 de julio en Colombia, el Congreso decidió, a partir del artículo 10, en adición al artículo 50 de la ley 1328 de 2009, realizar una, pues digamos, una ley que ha sido una reforma a todos los temas de protección del consumidor. Entonces, ellos acá establecieron de que las personas que tuvieran créditos por debajo de 880 salarios mínimos legales vigentes en Colombia en el año 2012 podían prepagar sus créditos sin penalidad alguna. Sin embargo, las personas, pues, o las personas o empresas que tuvieran créditos por encima de 880 salarios mínimos, igual iban a quedarse restringidos a esta penalidad. En ese momento, la ley establece que eso sería solamente para los nuevos préstamos que se tomaran luego de establecida la ley. Dado que esa ley tuvo un impacto muy grande, digamos, en todo, pues en los consumidores de créditos en Colombia, pues hubo algunas demandas establecidas debido a que eso solamente se podía hacer cuando tomabas un nuevo crédito, es decir, las personas que ya venían con créditos establecidos, pues seguían afectadas por esos créditos. Entonces, a partir de algunas negociaciones, hubo una sentencia en mayo 23 del 2013, donde se dice que a partir de ese momento, no importa de que el crédito lo hubieran tomado antes de la ley de 2012, sino que también las personas que tuvieran crédito por debajo de ese corte, es decir, 880 salarios mínimos, ya podían también prepagar el crédito sin tener que pagar ninguna penalidad. Entonces, pues establecía como las condiciones iguales, tanto para los que ya tenían crédito como para los que iban a tomar nuevos créditos. Entonces, de ahí, logramos tener la muestra, digamos, de que venía sin haber tenido, que venían teniendo que haber pagado penalidad anteriormente al mayo 2013, y que ahora se iban a beneficiar de esta ley y ya no iban a tener que pagar penalidad. Entonces, pues vamos a tener dos puntos importantes, pero el principal y en el que nosotros nos vamos a basar y vamos a hacer nuestro estudio econométrico va a ser todos los créditos que se tomaron antes de la ley 1555 y que van a continuar luego de la sentencia de 2013 y que ya esos créditos se pueden prepagar sin ninguna penalidad. Listo, entonces, en Colombia las penalidades pueden ser impuestas de forma parcial o total. Dada la data que teníamos, no sabemos exactamente cuánto es la penalidad que se le cobra a cada una de las personas si prepagan, ya que pues las penalidades son discrecionales de cada banco y ellos son los que definen cómo establecen sus contratos con los agentes. Y que el monto de penalidad se define dado pues el balance de crédito al momento de hacer el prepago. Nuestras principales preguntas de investigación fueron las siguientes: eliminar las penalidades de prepago afectaría el comportamiento de los consumidores de créditos luego de la sentencia 313 de mayo de 2023. Creció esa probabilidad de prepago, es decir, esa ley sí funcionó y las personas empezaron a prepagar sus créditos comerciales. Listo. La segunda, esa sentencia generó un efecto en el comportamiento de default de los créditos comerciales y la sentencia causó un aumento en las tasas de interés, transmitiendo el costo de la penalidad a mayores costos de financiamiento luego de que estas empresas tomaban nuevos créditos. Listo, entonces el objetivo es, vamos a estudiar el efecto de eliminar las penalidades de prepago en los créditos comerciales utilizando esa ley pues de gran importancia durante el año 2012-2013, esa sentencia. Y utilizamos un modelo de regresión discontinua con una rica base de datos que tiene toda la información de todos los préstamos comerciales en Colombia desde el año 2004 hasta el año 2017. ¿Cuál es la principal contribución de nuestro trabajo? Pensamos que analizar las penalidades de prepagos y su efecto en el comportamiento de los consumidores es súper importante, sobre todo porque lo vamos a hacer desde el punto de vista de créditos comerciales, a diferencia de cómo lo hacen pues, en el resto de la literatura, que se basan principalmente en créditos hipotecarios. Y en nuestro conocimiento, ese es el primer paper que analiza ese efecto en créditos comerciales. Vamos a utilizar una regresión discontinua, pues que es un modelo econométrico diferente al que generalmente se utiliza en la literatura, que es un modelo multinomial Loy, y con eso vamos a poder medir el efecto que tuvo dada esa sentencia en los créditos comerciales, en la eliminación de las penalidades de prepago. Pues ese es el modelo que nosotros utilizamos, estudiamos, hicimos las estimaciones por créditos, hicimos las estimaciones por firma, pues la idea es encontrar qué efecto tuvo para estos créditos que ya venían funcionando y que se beneficiaron de la eliminación de las penalidades con la sentencia. Y hacemos un cross-section por trimestre. Entonces acá presentamos pues el grafiquito de cuál es nuestro grupo tratado y cuál es nuestro grupo de control. Nuestro grupo tratado se basa, es básicamente todos los créditos, como les decía anteriormente, que estaban vigentes al momento de la ley, que continuaron luego de la sentencia y que se encuentran por debajo de 880 salarios mínimos legales vigentes. Y nuestro grupo de control son todos esos créditos que fueron tomados antes de la ley y que continuaron luego de la sentencia y que se encuentran por encima de 880 salarios mínimos legales vigentes. En nuestro estudio nosotros en el modelo hicimos varios bandwidths a partir de 880 salarios mínimos y nos movimos entre 100, 120 y 180 veces estos salarios mínimos. La información que tenemos de créditos comerciales, pues nos enfocamos en el reporte formato 341, donde tenemos toda la información de los deudores individuales y todas las operaciones activas de crédito que lo recolecta la Superfinanciera, que es el organismo de regulación de banca en Colombia. Ese formato contiene información detallada trimestral de todas las operaciones individuales de crédito de todos los individuos desde el primer trimestre de 2004 hasta el cuarto trimestre de 2017 con más de 30 millones de observaciones. Nosotros nos enfocamos en créditos comerciales, pues que fueron tomados antes de la ley y que continúan luego de la sentencia, y medimos el efecto de eliminar las penalidades de prepago y nos enfocamos en algunas variables, pues algunas variables como fueron la probabilidad de prepagar, la tasa de interés y la moratoria de los créditos. Entonces, como nos enfocamos en pues específicamente en estos tipos de crédito, entonces vamos a tener 3.485.076 observaciones, pues hacemos como una especie de limpieza de nuestra base de datos, donde pues nos enfocamos, eliminamos los datos atípicos y raros de las bases de datos, pues la reestructuramos con las condiciones que necesitamos para poder hacer nuestras estimaciones y finalmente pues encontramos una base de datos donde tenemos 157.595 préstamos comerciales durante estos 18 trimestres y vamos a mirar específicamente el efecto que tuvo luego de la ley del 2013. Y como les decía, pues los bandwidths nos movimos entre 100 y 200 veces los 880 salarios mínimos. Nuestras variables outcomes, pues como les decía, la probabilidad de prepagar, el total de números de créditos y el balance del préstamo, la tasa de interés, el número de intereses pagados y las tasas de delincuencia a 1, 30, 60 y 90 días. Acá pues realizamos unas estadísticas descriptivas de las variables en el baseline con el objetivo de detectar cómo se comportaban nuestras principales variables de control tanto pues el tamaño del préstamo, la tasa de interés pagada al momento del desembolso, pues los tipos de riesgos que tenían los créditos de los clientes al desembolso y los trimestres entre el desembolso y la sentencia. También predeterminamos algunas variables de control, como por ejemplo la probabilidad de que el crédito entrara en mora, la pérdida de que el crédito entrara en mora, el tipo de riesgo del cliente en el momento, pues antes de la sentencia, que ese sería pues como nuestro baseline. Entonces hacemos todo eso para el trimestre antes específicamente de la sentencia. Realizamos una prueba de selección de nuestra muestra con el objetivo de observar pues que no hubiera manipulación en nuestra base de datos y posteriormente pues ya comenzamos a mirar cuáles son los efectos de que sí pues sí hubo un aumento de la probabilidad de pagar el crédito luego de la sentencia. Acá observamos, hicimos nuestras estimaciones agregando el efectos heterogéneos, es decir, lo observamos a partir de diferentes características que tuvieran los créditos. Por ejemplo, aquí podemos observar la probabilidad de prepago, dado de que el crédito tuviera una duración mayor a 2.500 días. Entonces vemos un efecto positivo y significativo en el aumento del prepago de crédito. Este modelo pues es un RDD paramétrico y contrastamos también con un RDD no paramétrico donde encontramos efectos muy similares. Otro efecto heterogéneo que utilizamos es la probabilidad de pagar, dado de que la tasa de interés del crédito fuera mayor al 12%, lo hicimos también paramétrico y no paramétrico, y que la tasa de interés fuera mayor a 13%, y también lo hicimos para tasas mayores del 14%. Entonces acá pues podemos ver esos mismos grafiquitos, pues representan esta tabla, y vemos que en efecto luego del 2000, pues aproximadamente 2014 Q4 empieza a haber efectos positivos y significativos en los intervalos de bandwidth, digamos de 100, y cuando tenemos efectos heterogéneos de créditos que tienen duración mayor a 2000 y mayor a 2500. Y encontramos un efecto también positivo y significativo cuando existen efectos heterogéneos de tasa de interés mayor a 12 en los años entre 2014 Q4, 2014 Q3 y 2014 Q4. Se ve pues que los efectos empiezan a ser más visibles luego de la sentencia. Acá también analizamos el efecto de la eliminación de estos prepagos en la tasa de interés. Podemos observar lo hicimos también para la tasa de interés y para los intereses pagados, que también lo pueden observar en la tabla del paper específicamente, y vemos que es un efecto que se tarda un poco más, pero por ejemplo cuando tenemos el caso de créditos con efectos heterogéneos de tasas mayores a 13 y 14%, vemos que hay un efecto positivo y significativo en el aumento de la tasa de interés. Entonces fíjense que a partir de pues las tasas de interés empiezan a aumentar desde el año 2014 Q2 y el efecto se mantiene aproximadamente hasta 2015 Q2, donde especialmente para créditos que tuvieran tasas de interés altas y fueron prepagados, pues el efecto en las nuevas tasas de crédito que tomaron fue mucho mayor, pues demostrando de que hubo una transmisión de los costos de las penalidades el costo de los nuevos créditos. Acá también pues encontramos resultados con respecto a la moratoria de los créditos. Esto pues al principio fue un poco contraintuitivo de que, de que digamos que la mora luego de la sentencia empezara a aumentar, pero es específicamente para créditos que tenían mora mayores de un día. Entonces, podemos decir de que puede ser que estas personas en el momento de obtener la ley empezaron a hacer, digamos, los trámites para poder prepagar sus créditos y inicialmente tuvieron pues como un aumento, digamos, de la mora en lo que hacían esas gestiones, y eso lo comprobamos realizando estas estimaciones para créditos que tuvieran moras mayores a 30 días. Y ya vemos sí que luego de la sentencia empieza a disminuir significativamente la mora de los créditos. Es decir, cuando ya las personas decidían prepagar estos créditos, pues el efecto en disminuir créditos que quedaran ahí morosos y con alguna posibilidad a largo plazo de default, pues ya empezó a disminuir significativamente las moras. Estos efectos los encontramos fundamentalmente para créditos de duración mayor a 2.000 y mayor a 2.500 días. Sin embargo, cuando evaluamos por efectos heterogéneos en tasa, pues no encontramos efectos positivos, pues efectos negativos y significativos. Hicimos el mismo estudio para créditos cuando tuvieran mora mayor a 90 días y podemos observar que ya más o menos alrededor de 2015 Q1 pues empieza a encontrar un efecto negativo, es decir, disminuyó la mora de los créditos. Las principales conclusiones de nuestro trabajo, primeramente, pues encontramos una fuerte evidencia de que sí hubo un incremento en el prepago de los créditos comerciales. Es decir, esa ley sí cambió las actitudes, es decir, el comportamiento intertemporal de los consumidores de créditos comerciales en Colombia, donde tuvo un efecto positivo y significativo en el prepago de los créditos. Por lo que pensamos que pues las personas que tenían créditos en Colombia se beneficiaron de esa reforma. Fue una reforma que tuvo un efecto pues en cambiar sus decisiones intertemporales de consumo de crédito y de pagos de crédito. También encontramos que hubo una reducción en la mora de los créditos, es decir, vemos que luego de la sentencia, puede ser que muchos créditos que tenían comportamientos moratorios, estos clientes decidieron prepagarlos y eso hizo que disminuyera esas moras. Y nuestro modelo es consistente en los resultados obtenidos tanto por pues la estimación paramétrica y el procedimiento no paramétrico a partir de nuestro diseño de regresión discontinua. Otro resultado importante es que sí vemos de que hubo un cambio en el comportamiento de las tasas de interés de estas nuevas firmas que tomaron nuevos créditos y que se les cargó las penalidades aumentando la tasa de interés, sobre todo, digamos, para créditos que tenían tasas de interés por encima del 14%. Consideramos que nuestros resultados tienen un importante y potencial efecto, tanto micro como macro, ya que demuestra cuáles pueden ser las implicaciones de política, eliminar, digamos, una regulación a los créditos, como es las penalidades de los prepagos de los créditos, muestra de que, pues, de que llevar a cabo regulaciones que ayuden de manera positiva a los prestatarios puede tener un impacto en su comportamiento intertemporal de pagos de créditos, pero a la vez demuestra que el mercado colombiano es un mercado muy concentrado y que aún así los bancos pueden tener mucho poder de mercado y pueden transferir los costos, digamos, de estas penalidades fácilmente al aumento de las tasas de interés de los nuevos créditos. Y consideramos que nuestro trabajo contribuye de forma importante al debate del impacto que pueden tener regulaciones en créditos comerciales y que esto puede ser un paso inicial para otros estudios donde miren estos efectos de estas leyes en los prepagos de créditos comerciales pues a nivel de empresarial y no solamente en temas de créditos hipotecarios. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
Sí, hola Vida, yo tengo una pregunta. ¿Puedo?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Ok. Vivian, una pregunta de la metodología. O sea, esto es como un FOSI-RD, ¿verdad? Porque es...
Sí,
te
hola.
da la probabilidad de usar la ley, pero no es obligatoria, ¿no? O sea, no todos...
Sí, no necesariamente todos tienen que prepagar, pues ellos tienen la posibilidad de prepagar y que no se le cobre penalidad.
Claro, entonces es como un FOSI, ¿no? Donde aumenta tu probabilidad de repago porque te están quitando la penalidad, digamos.
Ajá, sí.
¿Verdad? Entonces,
Sí.
ahí, solo por entender, ¿qué tan grande es ese efecto de de esa primera parte, ¿no? Porque de ese first stage de repago, porque dices que en las conclusiones mencionabas que era comparable a otros, pero no me quedó tan claro qué tan grande ese aumenta la probabilidad de repago y eso, qué implicaciones tiene dentro de los otros estimadores que ustedes tienen, ¿no? Porque sería como una IV, más o menos.
Como una variable instrumental,
Claro,
la ley,
estás usando
sí,
esa
sí.
primera, ¿no? Esa primera fase,
Ujú.
pero quisiera entender, solo por saber, ¿qué tan grande es ese efecto de esa primera fase?
Listo, listo, sí, claro que sí. Lo que ocurre es que, digamos, cuando ocurre la ley, obviamente los créditos que nosotros veníamos estudiando, pues en primera, la ley no dejó que esos créditos prepagaran. Entonces fue con la sentencia que ya ellos se pueden prepagar. Entonces en ese momento es que nosotros tenemos la capacidad de poder hacer la comparación entre el grupo de control que son los que no pudieron, digamos, prepagar los créditos porque igual tenían penalidad y que obviamente pues ellos pueden prepagar pero pagan la penalidad. Entonces aquí nosotros lo que estamos encontrando es un coeficiente que nos dice cuánto fue por encima la probabilidad de prepago de los que eran tratamiento con respecto a los control. Entonces fíjense que pues, más o menos está entre un 3 y un 3,5%, es decir, fue el aumento de la
Ok,
probabilidad de prepago del grupo de tratamiento con respecto al grupo de control. Ujú.
ok.
¿Listo?
Listo, gracias.
Bueno, con mucho gusto. Gracias a ti por la pregunta.
All right, if there are, there's a hand. Carlos.
Sí.
Hi,
Carlos es
thank you so much.
coautor.
Yes, I was just going to add something to Vivian's answer regarding actually what we are estimating here are intent to treat. Well, all of these are intent to treat effects. We didn't actually run the prepayment as a treatment variable, but just went and looked for the effects of the intervention on whether people prepaid or whether firms prepaid and whether they had to pay a higher rate. And one additional thing to highlight is that, because you will wonder, why would you prepay if you were going to pay a higher rate? So they actually do pay a lower rate than the baseline interest rate they were paying in the pay. But they still, when compared with the control firms, they end up paying, when they roll over the debt, they pay a higher rate. That's the thing.
Gracias, Carlos. Eh,
Okay, so I guess there are no further questions, so I will again attempt to share my presentation.
okay.
Yay, it's working now.
Bueno, gracias, Vida. Bueno.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so to close up the session, I'll present our paper titled Liquidity or Capital, the Impacts of Easing Credit Constraints in Rural Mexico. And this is joint work with a number of my former IDB and IDB Invest colleagues. And Maria Paula and Oscar are also here. Oh no, hold on. Let me manage it remotely. One sec, I'll have to try this again. You're no longer seeing my screen, right?
Nope.
All right, I might just share my desktop, see if that works better. Love this. Okay, does this work?
Yeah, we see it.
Okay. All right, so the motivation for this work is the fact that, as we know, insufficient access to credit is a key obstacle that prevents growth and economic opportunities in the developing world more broadly, but in this case, specifically the Mexican rural sector. And so while there is existing literature on the broader topic of access to credit, it largely focuses on the effects of the provision of microcredit and public credit programs for SMEs, and typically analyzes shorter term impacts. And in contrast to that, this paper focuses on the effects of medium-sized loans, so there's no microcredit here, on the productive performance on rural producers over around 2 to almost 4 years from the time that they received the loan. And in addition, while a lot of the literature either doesn't explicitly define what type of loan it's looking at, or it does explicitly say we're looking at loans for capital investment, we differentiate between 2 types of loans: so working capital loans and investment loans. A bit about the background. So these are loans provided to agricultural producers in rural Mexico by the Financiera Nacional de Desarrollo, so FND for short. And the loans are based on the intended purpose, classified as either loans for working capital or loans for investment in fixed assets. And obviously there's some differences in the characteristics of the loans, depending on which type they are. So working capital loans that tended to have a shorter repayment period. Typically this was up to a year. I think the average is about 9 months repayment period, whereas for investment in fixed assets, you're looking at a longer repayment period, between 4 and 6 years. Now, the FND embarked on a major expansion of its portfolio and introduced changes to the way it assessed loan applications and approved loans. So these were assessed based on a scoring model, but the scoring model varied significantly based on the type of loan and on the geographic location, so the bank branch that it was that the application was made in, among other things. So our focus will be on all the applications for loans in the period between 2012 and 2014. That's our treatment period. Now we have 2 sources of data. One is administrative data from the FND. And this is data on all loans for our sample of borrowers. Again, this is all applicants between 2012 and 2014. And then we have that data going back to 2003 and all the way to the middle of 2018. So this allows us to reconstruct their credit history with the FND. It includes information on the type of loan, the total amounts, the maturity, the interest rate, whether it came with a guarantee of some kind, the location of the FND branch, the type of borrower, so whether it was a firm or an individual, and the gender of the individual, the number of years they'd been engaged in the activity, and so forth. And then we have survey data. This survey was conducted starting in late 2016 and into 2017. And that's where we get the information on most of our outcomes of interest. So this is where we get data for the agricultural activity of the producers and their business practices. Now, when we're looking at the outcomes, the period that we're focusing on is the 2 agricultural seasons, or 1 agricultural year, between October 2015 and September 2016. So the agricultural year just prior to the start of the survey. The survey does gather some information on the years prior, but it's much less detailed than for this particular year. Oops. So a bit about the methodology. How do we define treatment? So we look at all applicants for loans in this treatment period, and those that received a loan are treated, those that did not are control. We estimate treatment effects by inverse probability weights, by using inverse probability weights based on a generalized propensity score for multiple treatments. So we have treatment 1, which is those that received a fixed asset or working capital loan. This latter group is quite small. And then the treatment 2 is if they received a working capital loan. And then obviously we have the control group. We estimate the generalized propensity score using the pre-treatment data from the administrative data set. So all the information that we have for 2003 to 2011, the detailed credit history, the geographic data, and so forth, we use in the estimation of the propensity score. And we impose simultaneous overlap based on that GPS distribution, which drops less than 1% of the observations for the survey sample. For the administrative data, it drops a little bit more, about 2%. Now, what does this mean for the treatment group? How did the treatment groups look like in terms of whether they received a loan or not? So this shows the likelihood of having a loan in each treatment group and in the pre-treatment, treatment, and post-treatment period. So by construction, everyone in the working capital loan group has a working capital loan in the treatment period. Same for the fixed asset loan group, where some people also have a working capital loan. And you see that obviously some people have loans before and after our treatment period as well. This obviously is before we use our inverse probability weights, before we impose simultaneous overlap. With those, this obviously changes, right? So I'm going to show what this looks like afterwards, right? And then we run some placebo tests to make sure that our methodology is working. So what we want to compare are differences between treated and control groups based on pre-treatment administrative data. So before inverse probability weighting, what you see in the raw outcomes, we're using 2003 to 2010 data to predict 2011. And these point estimates in black and red are the differences between each treatment group and the control. And obviously they're all significantly different from zero, right? Now, what we want to see if our methodology is working is that all those differences go away once you use IPW. And in point of fact, that's what happens. So once we look at whether people have a loan, a fixed asset or working capital, the number of loans, we were able to remove differences between the groups using our matching methodology, okay? So then we go to the next step, which is assess our problem regarding survey non-response. In our universe of applicants between 2012 and 2014, we had around 21,000 people. The intention was never to survey 21,000 people. The original plan was to interview about 4,000 applicants. But as soon as the survey was rolled out, it became apparent that there were significant differences in locating respondents. So the target was lowered to 3,000. Ultimately, it was necessary to attempt to contact close to 13,000, so it was about 12,800 people in order to get to that number. We have 2,758 completed and validated interviews. Now, the sources of the problem were various. In about 13% of cases, the enumerators couldn't even find the address that they were given. 30% of cases, they found the address, but it no longer corresponded to the borrower or the applicant rather, which to some extent, it's like the person had moved, which to some extent is not unreasonable given that if a person had applied for a loan in 2012, we're now trying to interview them in 2017, that's 5 years. So in about 25% of cases, the problem was that even though the address was right and it still corresponded to the right person, they were never home, even after multiple visits. And then we have a small number, about 8% of outright refusals to complete the interview. But so regardless of the cause, the extent of this non-response raises potential selection bias issues, obviously. And to analyze how big a problem we have, we use the administrative data, because obviously we have the administrative data for everyone prior to the treatment period. And first we compare just the raw differences in pre-treatment outcomes for surveyed versus non-surveyed. So all of that data on, for instance, who has a loan and how many loans, we can look at that and compare the two groups. Then obviously, we also need to check whether there's a difference between whether we surveyed more treated versus control. So here, based on that pre-treatment data, we estimate the probability of survey participation. And third, we compare treatment effects for surveyed and non-surveyed applicants. So we run our inverse probability weights and we look at after 2015, their just likelihood of having a credit for surveyed and non-surveyed. Here I will show 1 and 3. The second, which is the survey participation, it's in the paper and it's broadly similar for the treated and control groups. So first, the raw differences in pre-treatment outcomes for surveyed and non-surveyed. Here we show the probability of having a loan. It's fixed asset or working capital loan in each year prior to treatment. And you see that basically there's all of these are not, none of them are significantly different from zero. So differences between surveyed and non-surveyed. We also look at other things, so more the intensive margins, and then not just the probability of having any kind of loan, but the number of loans by type and the loan amounts. And this picture remains broadly the same. So it does not seem like ex ante, there is a significant difference between surveyed and non-surveyed. Then we compare treatment effects. So as I said, whether or not they have each type of loan after the treatment period using our multiple treatment matching. And here we don't find any differences either. So the surveyed, which is the little diamond, and the not surveyed, which is the black circle, are equally likely basically to have each type of loan. Okay, so surveyed and non-surveyed applicants are comparable in this regard. So in summary, despite our data issues, it seems that the survey sample is comparable on observables from the admin data to the population. Based on that pre-treatment administrative data, the likelihood of participating in the survey is similar for treatment and control. And we show that the effect of the program on post-treatment outcomes is the same for surveyed and for non-surveyed applicants. And so with that, we proceed to the next step, which is estimating the treatment effects for the survey sample. So here we look at our outcomes of interest. So as I said, all of our respondents are rural producers. Now, some are engaged in agriculture, meaning they cultivate crops, and some raise animals. Out of our 3,000, almost 3,000 people in the sample, more than 3/4 cultivate crops. About 40% or so have animals. So most of the results that we have in the paper and that I will show here are for the group, for the agriculture group. I'll only briefly mention some results for animals. There we have the issue of just the size of the sample is not necessarily large enough to identify many effects. So here, first we look at production decisions. So whether getting a loan from the FND loan program changes what you grow. And here we find that there is an increase in the probability of cultivating and selling some key annual crops. Most of this effect is concentrated in the working capital loan group. So we see that they are, this group is 9 percentage points more likely to cultivate any crops. This is driven by an increase in the cultivation of annual crops, which in turn is mostly driven by the increase in the cultivation of maize. This includes both white and yellow maize, white maize being by far the most commonly grown crop in the sample. And then the likelihood of growing them is matched by an increase in the probability that you sell those crops. We see maybe some effect on maize in the fixed asset group, but again, most of this change in what is grown is seen in the working capital group. We then look at, among those that grow these crops, what are the effects on their productivity? So we look at production amounts and the value of their production and sales per hectare. This is conditional on growing. So we're showing, for instance, the top 5 annual crops only for those who produced some crops in this period. And what you see is that actually in both groups, working capital and fixed asset, we see significant increases in productivity. For all annual crops, for top 5 annual crops, which include maize, and then for maize only in fixed assets, in the fixed asset loan group. And we see a similar increase in the sales of those top 5 annual crops. These effects translate to about 0.3 to 0.5 standard deviations. Okay. We then look at what are the potential mechanisms? How did this increase in productivity come about? So the first one that we look at are inputs. And here I have to say, when the FND approves loans, it also shares recommendations, a set of recommendations called the Paquete Tecnológico, which is a set of kind of recommendations made by the, developed by the Mexican government for every geographic area, and for every crop. They have a list of kind of instructions, what you should be doing. If you're growing wheat, what kind of seed should you be using? What kind of fertilizer, pesticide, and so forth should you be using with that seed? And so all loans all working capital loans are approved with this set of recommendations. Although in most cases there's no tracking of whether you adopt these recommendations or not. So what we see in our results is that there is a higher probability and more intensive use of inputs that are part of the Paquete Tecnológico. So here we see treatment effects for the fixed asset and for the working capital group. And unsurprisingly, these effects are also concentrated in the working capital group. So for instance, the likelihood of using any inputs from this package increases only by 3 percentage points, which is about as far as you could go, given that, you know, even in the control group, 94% already use at least something. But the intensity of use rises by about 0.6 compared to a control group mean of 3.4, which is a significant increase. We also look at stuff like improved cultivation practices. This is like soil tillage for conservation and pruning and stuff like that. And there we find maybe a slight effect in the working capital group of 8 percentage points compared to the control. One thing we look at extensively in the paper, but I'm not showing here because we don't find any results, are the is the use of large machinery and equipment, such as would be supported with a fixed asset loan. So use of tractors or combine harvesters, mechanized irrigation systems, and so forth. Any of these large things that you would be buying with a fixed asset loan, we don't find that any of this is being used more by the farmers in the sample. Okay. Now, the next input that we look at is labor. And here we do find that there is some apparently increased reliance on paid labor. So this is particularly visible in the fixed asset treatment group. So first we look at the amount of labor put in. We construct a measure of full-time equivalent workdays, and this increases significantly in the fixed asset group. And then this result is validated later from a different section of the questionnaire, which asks for all costs by type. And here we see that labor costs per hectare also increase significantly in the fixed asset group. The increase in the working capital group is just not, it's not statistically significant, almost there, but no. A few additional things we look at. So as I said, animals, we have the problem that this group is often not large enough to identify strong effects. We do see some increases in the ownership of animals. So for instance, the most common animal in the sample is cows, and the number of cows owned increases significantly in the fixed asset treatment group, which cows are fixed assets in this case. And on the other hand, we don't find any statistically significant effects on productivity, again, with the caveat that sample size is a problem, and that actually measuring productivity for animal producers, given the very wide variety of animal products, is fairly tricky. And then another thing we look at is credit behavior and business practices. So here we look at whether those in treated groups are more likely to want to borrow again, either from private banks or from the FND. And what we find is the working capital loan recipients are more likely to want to borrow, want to get another FND loan. And in general, this is something we see a lot in the administrative data. A lot of working capital loans are rolled over repeatedly. And then we also see that both treated groups are more likely to hold insurance, about 13 percentage points more likely. And particularly in the fixed asset group, they're more likely to use better accounting practices. So they're more likely to have an accountant or hire an accountant when needed, They save tax receipts. They keep formal books. So all of those things more common in both groups, but again, more likely in fixed asset. So what are our conclusions from all this? First of all, regardless of loan type, it looks like these loans did lead to increases in productivity for certain crops, in particular annuals, and on the value of production and sales per hectare. Now, these productivity gains appear to have been achieved through a more intensive use of these improved inputs that were recommended, and an increase in paid labor. On the other hand, we don't find much of an impact at all on capital investment. So policy implications from all this. One is that programs often focus only on funding fixed asset investment. This is viewed, lack of capital is viewed as the key barrier to productivity growth. And what we find is that basically working capital might be at least as important a constraint on productivity as the lack of capital. Or rather, the providing liquidity seems to be as important as providing funding for investment. That said, the caveat is, at least for this type of borrowers, we don't have very small firms. And second, the liquidity provided by this type of program, which is easily rolled over short-term loans. The second policy implication is that these types of programs probably need to incorporate better monitoring on the uses of funding. So again, our key surprising result is that we have no effects on the use of fixed assets. And if there was systematic tracking of information regarding purchases of fixed asset by borrowers, so if you took out a loan to buy land, did you actually buy land? Perhaps this information is collected or monitored at the branch level, but there is no systematic tracking, no digital tracking, no database of this type of information. And it would be important to integrate that in future programs. All right. That's it from me. Any questions? This is going to be the quickest session in the whole. All right, Carlos.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I actually have a question for Bernardo. I was wondering, I mean, if you have a very interesting data, I mean, very detailed data for you to come out with information at the branch level, if I understood well. But I was wondering, I mean, whether you, because, I mean, to disentangle after the merge, the information of the acquirer versus the bot, I mean, the target bank, it should be hard. And I wonder whether you made an exercise in which you consolidated both banks all through the period before and after to compare it with the treated.
Thanks for the question. So I think, let me see if I understood correctly. You're wondering how you were able to identify the branches after the M&A?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, the thing is, yes, I mean, how to know, I mean, like, for example, the target bank, after the merge, the profits, for example, how to split the profits once merged between the target and the acquirer and so on, that might be tough. But if you had like the consolidated balance of both target and acquirer, it should be.
No, yeah, because the data is that so each branch has a unique identifier. So we are able to follow the branch even after the same branch that would belong to the target, even after the M&A, because this branch has a unique identifier. It has a unique like tax ID and a unique address. So we are able to follow, even though the branch now belongs to the same group, we are still able to. So our definition of target is, you know, before the merger, it like it belonged to the target bank, and then you just like continue to classify this branch as a target branch. But even though it belongs to the new conglomerate now, but we are able to keep the information because you know they have to report this data at the plant level, let's say.
Yeah, but for example, I know this from insurance companies that for example, when there is like a claim from a client who had a loss, then sometimes they charge the whole loss to the branch, but sometimes they kind of split it and kind of hedge it with the like national direction or the branches who went to the deal also. So I mean that might be something I mean, to bear in mind, but maybe in your case it's not a big deal.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I understood the question, but yeah, but you're wondering about like some measurement error at the branch level or something like this? No.
No. It's basically whether like after the merge, I mean, because before the merge, maybe one bank might be accounting like earnings, profits, so one way, but after the merge, once the bank is merged, the accounting might change, and maybe the profits of the branch, a specific branch, might be like mixed with that of other branches or accounted in a different way. So I wonder
I see.
whether it is comparable.
Yeah, no, so this is data from the central bank that we are using. So they have to report this to central bank. And so it could be true that, I mean, there is something that they're changing, like the way they report things, but we see, I mean, but we see very persistent effects after that. And they still have to report the data in the same way. For example, the amount of loans, for example, they should report at the plant level and to the central bank. So we collected this at the central bank. And
yes, there are some things which are very straightforward, like the number of employees and yes, and the deposits. But maybe profits might change. So if you have split the target and the acquirer, then you may have an effect on the way they are accounted, and another because of the merge, and then you wouldn't know. I mean, whether there was a change in the accounting of some of the balance accounts, or whether it was because of the merge. That's but if you have the consolidated, then you will know.
Yeah, I see. I think so. Okay, so I see you're worried that the results are driven by not by changes in the the production at let's say at the plant level, but changes like an accounting or something like this. No, sorry, but no, I understand the concern. Yeah, but the yeah, maybe we can talk later. I'm not sure if I fully understood the question, but yeah. So maybe we can keep talking later if you don't mind. So, sorry, because I think I didn't understand really well the question. Sorry.
Any other questions or comments for any of the presenters?
So.
All right. Well.
Maybe sorry, can I ask you? So, Carlos, can I get your email, or can I? I'm gonna write Carlos because if you could write in the chat. I'm not sure if he's around, so I can write him. Trying to explain because yeah, I'm sorry.
I think you can find him in the conference chat, that the little function.
Okay, I'm gonna try to find him to email him.
This will disappear.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you to everyone and my fellow presenters. It was nice to see everyone here today, and enjoy the rest of the conference and the weekend.
Thank you.